Hello, and welcome back to the Fourth and Long-Winded Podcast. I'm Cody, and with me is Dan. And Dan is going to present to us his top 10 dynasties of the modern college football era. So I think we can go ahead and get on over to you, Dan. You want to start?
Well, Cody, I know you're asking yourself right now, what the hell does he mean by the modern era? And I'm really happy you asked that question because I define the modern era as anything after 1980. So in the 80s, that's where you got the introduction of a lot of modern day recruiting regulations. TV was growing, so becoming a more national sport. You know, television with marketing was becoming more of a thing with Michael Jordan and Nike at the time. So I believe the modern era would be considered 1980 on. So we're going to do dynasties that the best dynasties since 1980.
Okay. All right. Well, then I'm excited. So let's get into this.
All right. So before we get started with this top 10, I want to put a little qualifier or a couple qualifiers on what my criteria was to get into this list. A couple things. Has to be at least 4 years long. Has to at least have won one national championship. There has to be some noteworthy coaches or players. Most of these will, of course. If it's a dynasty, it's almost guaranteed to have some great coaches and players. I want them to have an exciting brand of football. And, that's just about it. So let's get into number 10 on the top 10 dynasties of the modern era. North Dakota State Bison. All right. I kind of had to put them on this list. I felt wrong if I left them off just for what they've done the last 10 years. I mean, if you can read it on the screen there, just eight out of the nine national championships in the FCS, and just a ridiculous record. 128-8 entering this spring season, and they're now, I think, 2-1 because they got back on track this past weekend. At the time of recording, they're 2-1. And then they did have a victory over number 13 Iowa back in 2016. And that's basically the only Division I team that's been like, all right, we'll play you, because everybody's pretty much scared to, because they don't want to lose to an FCS team. So I don't want to get in too much more about North Dakota State. It's kind of obvious they've been dominant. They're a dynasty. So I put them in at number
10. I think that this is a particularly important dynasty because it is a small school, but it really, they've changed a lot of really what we consider to be football. I mean, the coaching tree that's come out of there has been pretty incredible.
All right, let's move on to number 9. Number 9 is the Ohio State Buckeyes from 2002 to 2010. Head coach was Jim Tressel at the time. They won one championship in 2002, and they had 3 total appearances in the title game over that stretch in 02, obviously, and then 06 and 07. They had a record of 99-17 with 6 Big Ten championships and an undefeated season in 2002. Over the stretch, they had 13 All-Americans. They were kind of edged. It was between this and the kind of current Ohio State dynasty that was going to make this list. Basically 2012 through the present day Ohio State. What kind of broke the tie, if you will, is the Ohio State from 02 to 2010 had an extra Big Ten championship and an extra title game appearance. So, I mean, there's really a toss-up. They're pretty identical if you look at it. It's kind of crazy. But I wanted to hit on a couple key players. They did have a Heisman Trophy winner in 2006, Troy Smith. I hate Ohio State, but he was fun to watch that year. I do remember that. Maurice Clarett in 02. It was 1 year of probably one of the best running back seasons ever. Terrell Pryor, Santonio Holmes, Ted Ginn, James Laurinaitis, A.J. Hawk. I mean, the list goes on from some of the great players from this time period in Ohio State history. But I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Cody.
The only thing that I would say is it almost feels like this dynasty never ended.
I mean, it kind of did end with the
the 7-6 season where Fickle was the head coach, and
then they got the bowl ban right before. I mean,
and like I understand that, but I have to say, like, watching this team and being a Michigan fan, like, there's 2 years since 2000 that they have not beat Michigan. That's like extremely dominant, and Michigan's not a cream puff program.
Yeah.
Since 2000, Ohio State has been the team in the Big Ten.
100%.
So that would be the only thing that I would say. I mean, I agree that there was like that fall off, and you do change coaches, but it still kind of feels like it never ended.
You totally could just be like Ohio State from 2002 to present and just be done with it. But I don't know. I felt like splitting it up. I'm not going to split hairs too much. It's
fair enough.
You can go either way. All right, let's move on to number 8 in our countdown. Now, this school, or number 8 and 9 could easily be flipped, and I wouldn't put up too much of an argument. I put LSU in front because I hate Ohio State, so that's why I put LSU in front. Come at me, Ohio State fans. Come at me. So this spanned 2 head coaches, obviously Nick Saban winning in 2003, the national championship, and then Les Miles winning his national championship in 2007. They had a 97-22 record, so slightly worse than the Ohio State record over this time period. 3 SEC championships, which isn't an outstanding number, but it is the SEC. And I think 3 SEC championships over that time period is pretty decent. Like, you can't complain about that. So they had 3 total.
Especially because Bama was coached by Nick Saban during some of those years.
Yeah. And you had Florida with Urban Meyer and Tim Tebow during that time period. So there's a lot of good SEC teams at that time. So they had 3 total appearances in the national championship game: 2003, 2007, and 2011. They had 16 All-Americans during this time. They went 6-3 in their bowl games. They don't really have the top tier players that stand out in your mind like the Ohio State team did. You got Jamarcus Russell and Andrew Whitworth, who's still repping it in the league right now. Matt Flynn, Jordan Jefferson, like Joseph Adai, Patrick Peterson. Those are some of the big ones, but maybe not the sexiest dynasty, but I mean, 2 championships, 3 appearances. I think that's a dynasty. So let's move on to number 7 in the list. Is the Miami Hurricanes from the year 2000 to 2003. The U Part 2. So this has just got to be the most dominant 4-year stretch of just about any team ever. They went 46-4, which is ridiculous, with 34 wins in a row at one point. They did win 1 championship in 2001, won the Big East all 4 years. Isn't really saying too much because the Big East is kind of trash, but they still won all 4 of those. And, I mean, what really puts this team over the edge is just the ridiculous amount of talent that was on both sides of the ball. I mean, for 4 years, they had 17 All-Americans. In 4 years, they had 17. That's insane. They had 17 players drafted in the first round out of these 4 years, which is also just crazy. What are your thoughts on the U, Cody?
So I have to say that I think the Big East, like, everyone thought they were bad because Miami was so dominant.
It's a fair point.
Because after this stretch, the Big East arguably was one of the, lower BCS conferences, and that's a fair statement. But they had teams that were ranked as high as 3 after this.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing comes to mind is UC at the end of the decade. UC had
and I know that there's a big difference between 2003 and 2009, but that's not to say a lot of those teams are teams that are competing now for pretty high accolades. So I think that, it is a knock on the Big East because the Big East wasn't that great, but man, this team was just so dominant.
Oh my God. So fun to watch too. I don't know if you've seen that documentary on the U.
Oh yeah.
It's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen. Highly recommend. If you haven't seen it, go watch that. But yeah, it's pretty cut and dry with this team. I think they deserve to be on here. So let's move on to number 6. We have the Clemson Tigers of present day, 2011 to the present, to be exact. They still have a lot of room where they could go up on this list if they don't drop off a cliff over the next couple of years. You could see them rise up this list for me. But obviously, head coach Dabo Swinney turned around the Clemson program. Clemson was nothing previously, I think they won the national championship in 1980 or something like that. But they hadn't been relevant really until Dabo came on the scene. Since then, they've won 2 championships, 4 total appearances in the college football playoff championship, 121-18, at least 10 wins in every single season, which is kind of crazy. And then they had 1 undefeated season. In 2018, a year they went 15-0 and won the championship. They have 7 ACC championships over that stretch, and they've won 6 in a row up to the current date. So, what are your thoughts on Clemson here at number 6, Cody?
Well, so I have 2 thoughts, and my first one is that it kind of rolls off that no end in sight. Is that the ACC below Clemson is pretty wide open. I mean, the opposite.
It's getting more competitive.
Every team win the division at least once in the same number of teams. That was impressive that had happened. So I mean, it's a level of parity, but it's also, it goes to say that the league itself is not. There isn't another team in this league that's just standing there waiting to take their place.
Yeah.
So that's
we did get the chance to see it last year. Notre Dame and being in the ACC, we got to see what that looks like. Clemson having another big boy in their conference, and I mean North Carolina's coming. I've seen North Carolina preseason for this coming year. They're going to be preseason ranked in the top 10. It looks like there's a lot of hype going around that North Carolina team. So maybe that'll be
hyping up North Carolina for years now. I
they're finally
said
getting
when Mac Brown got there, I'm pretty sure I had a conversation with you. I'm like, I think they're going to be competing for titles in the next few years.
I don't think I was fully with you like that. I don't envision North Carolina competing for national championships with Mac Brown.
If they can get one over on Clemson, I think it's possible.
The only reason that Mac Brown has 1 championship is because Vince Young. That is legitimately the only reason.
I get it. I'm just saying I like to hope. But that being said, my other point about Clemson is that before 2011, before Dabo really was there and established, they weren't even the best team in their state.
No.
South Carolina was much better. And that was right around the time that I was really getting into watching football. And my whole perception of the state of South Carolina was it was ran by South Carolina.
Yeah, and you didn't even think about Clemson.
No. And I knew Clemson had a national championship that South Carolina didn't, but it's kind of like talking about Minnesota's national championships. That's the way it felt.
Yeah.
So it's beyond impressive what Dabo Swinney has done at Clemson.
100%.
No other way to describe it.
All right, let's move on to number 5 on our list. Another ACC school, the Florida State Seminoles from 92 to the year 2000. Bobby Bowden has got to be one of the best coaches of all time. I think that he's got to be in the top 5 coaches of all time. I think that maybe not top 5. That's a whole nother video. Coaches of all time. But during this stretch, he won 2 national championships, 93 and 99. Yes. 99 and 11 and 1 over this time, including 10 or more wins in every single year and an undefeated season in 1999. So Florida State was an independent up until 1992, and then they joined the ACC in 1992, and then proceeded to win 9 straight ACC championships, which is kind of crazy. They had 20 All-Americans during this time period. Some of the key players, they did have 2 Heisman winners, Chris Winkie and Charlie Ward. Charlie Ward, one of the best 2 sport athletes of all time, doesn't get the recognition. He was a great basketball player in the NBA. Warwick Dunn, who is one of my favorite guys to use in NFL, like 2K1 or 2K2 or something like that. Him and another Florida State legend, Peter Warwick. And then, of course, the greatest kicker of all time, Sebastian Janikowski, was on the teams in the late 90s. But this team was pretty much this team and another team that is actually going to be on this list in a little bit, a little tease. They ran the 90s. 2 teams ran the 90s, and this Florida State team was one of them. So I felt like they had to be on this list. I don't know.
So the only thing that I have to say about this is I was recently listening to another podcast, the Cover 3 podcast. It's a CBS Sports podcast, and Danny Cannell is one of the hosts, and he was on this. He was on for 94, 95. I think he was a freshman in 93, maybe. No, he was a sophomore in 93. And he talked about the 95 season. And I think if you looked at the list of players that they had on that team, there was one player, and I can't think of his name, that was he had to sit out that year because he had transferred from Notre Dame. And he was like absurdly good. But I can't remember his name.
You remember like position or anything?
I want to say it was wide receiver.
It might have been. Peter Warwick was later on.
Andre Cooper, maybe?
Okay, that sounds familiar. I don't have that in my list of key players, but
no, it wasn't Andre Cooper. It doesn't matter. He talked about that, and basically, like, they should have won the national championship in 95. Like, that definitely should have happened. If everyone would have been able to play, they would have been absurdly good.
But let's move on to number 4 for now. Number 4 is a personal favorite of mine. These USC Trojans from 2002 to 2008, they're the reason I'm still kind of a USC fan today. I mean, they were so fun to watch, and it was just the prime time period for me, being 8, 9, 10, 12 years old during this time period, watching Reggie Bush, Matt Leinart. Oh my God, so many studs on both sides. Defense, Troy Polamalu, Clay Matthews, Ray Malaluga, like the list goes on and on. Obviously, head coach Pete Carroll, but they won 2 championships during this time period. Some might say, wait, why? They actually split the championship in 2003 with LSU. So they were technically back-to-back championships, 03, 04. 04 was the one where they won it outright. And then they made the championship game again in 2005. And that's we just discussed Vince Young and Mac Brown. That's the infamous, or really famous. That's one of the most legendary games of all time. It's that Rose Bowl in 2005. 4th down and 5, the national championship is on the line. I remember that call. I always remember that call. But like I said before, personal attachment to this USC Trojans team. They went 82-9 over the stretch with 11 or more wins every year, which is kind of crazy. 1 undefeated season in 04. And they won 7 straight Pac-10 championships, which it was, of course, the Pac-10 at the time.
This is the team that played like the game of the century with Texas, right? In that Rose Bowl game.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah. I don't have a ton of thoughts. This is a great team. I don't have that same personal connection with them, but yeah, they were great.
I remember it was I played NCAA football 2005, 2004, whatever, and I just used Reggie Bush and just ran the ball every single play. He won the Heisman every single season with him. It was there's definitely a strong personal attachment, but I also feel like they deserve to be this high up on the list. But let's move on into number 3 on this list. Number 3 is a team we were discussing earlier that also dominated the 90s along with Florida State, the Nebraska Cornhuskers. 3 national championships during this time period. One of those split with Michigan in 97. They were 78-8 with 3 undefeated seasons. They were also an absurd 88-8 from 60-3. I was reading another team. Sorry, I apologize. They were 60-3 from the year 1993 through the year 1997, which is just kind of nuts. They had at least 11 wins every year. And then I tried to look up some key players, just some like recognizable talent from those teams. And there was 2 guys that I had heard of before. And it was Tommy Frazier, obviously the quarterback, who was basically their offense for his time at Nebraska. And then Amon Green. Amon Green was a running back. He played for I remember him playing for the Packers and being a decent running back. He was really good for Nebraska as well. Scott Frost was also a quarterback for the 97 national championship team, I believe. Tom Osborne was just a wizard. That's the only thing I can deduce from this, because like I said, you look back on the roster and it's like, yeah, I guess. And I'm obviously, I wasn't alive to see most of this. I wasn't even coherent enough. I was a baby. So maybe if I was alive, I would remember some of the players, but it's just like, none of them went on to have great NFL careers. So it's just like Tom Wizard must have just been, he's got to be one of the best coaches of all time. And I don't really know that much about him, but just looking back on these stats, it was just, I had to put him at 3 because it's just nuts.
I think that this team in particular benefited from their advanced strength and conditioning. Because so everyone was using strength and conditioning in the 90s, but Nebraska was also dominant in the 80s. Like they weren't this dominant, but they weren't. Yeah, they were quite dominant. They competed with the U in the 80s for quite a few of their titles. And that back in the 80s is when they started their strength and conditioning program. And actually Nebraska's why almost every team now has a serious focus on strength and conditioning, because they had less injuries. Their players lasted longer. I mean, they could go for the full 60 minutes. And it's something that cost a lot of teams games. And that was just because they were more prepared.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably where this came from, is they were just had better conditioning than anybody else.
Yeah. And Tom Osborne is a wizard.
That's fair.
Okay. All right, let's move on to number 2. It's the second appearance on this list for this team. It is the U, Part 1 from 1983 to 1992. 3 coaches during this time period: Howard Schnellenberger, Jimmy Johnson, of course, the famous Jimmy Johnson who went on to win Super Bowls with the Dallas Cowboys, and Dennis Erickson. Two championships for Dennis Erickson, and then 1 each for Jimmy Johnson and Schnellenberger. Great name, by the way, and a fun name to say, Schnellenberger. 107-14 over these 10 years. 10 wins in 9 of the 10 years, 2 undefeated seasons in 87 and 91. They were an independent for all but 2 years, the last 2 years when they moved into the Big East, and then they won the Big East both of those years. They had a 29-game winning streak at one point. They had 23 All-Americans over this stretch. Key players: Michael Irvin, Vinny Testaverde, who won the Heisman in 86, Gino Torretta, who won the Heisman in 92, Bernie Kosar, who is a personal favorite of a lot of Browns fans. He was like the last great Browns quarterback before Baker came along. And maybe great's a little strong word to describe Baker.
So the jury's still out on that.
Yeah. You had the Blades brothers, Benny and Brian Blades, Cortez Kennedy, Warren Sapp. I mean, these teams were nasty. They were aggressive. They'd hit you as hard as they possibly could, just because they could. They had a giant, it says there at the bottom of the screen, giant cultural impact. I mean, if you think of the way college football is viewed today in terms of people wearing gear and merchandise, and even not being it's because of this U in particular. The 2000 to 2003 also kind of built off that, but this is the original. This is the OG. You had people from Los Angeles wearing the U hats around. Like, the U became a national phenomenon, really, and it just really impacted the entire country, and it kind of shaped the way we look at college football today in a lot of ways. This has to be on this list, and there's an argument to put it at number one, but I just couldn't make an argument. You'll see why when we get there. But I don't want to say anything.
This is right along the lines of my thinking. This is one of the most exciting teams that I wish, like, if there was a team that I wish I could have watched before my time, this is it.
100%.
I've watched the U documentary from ESPN probably 30 times. I think that the U is one of those teams that is, when they're good, they're just so damn exciting. They're just so exciting to watch. They've got these braggadocious players that they're good and they know they're good. And no one cares that they are being showboats, because that's who they are. That's what the U is.
Well, what were you going to say to him? You think you're going to go up to Michael Irvin or Warren Sapp and be like, hey, you should stop doing that. You should just fall in line and be a normal player. You would have got your ass kicked if you did that.
Well, and I have like a couple things with this. Impact on the game. The reason we have touchdown celebration rules now is because of this team. Because they would celebrate and it would take off the other team so much that injuries would happen because of it. I mean, they would just go for low blows and things like that. And so the NCAA literally made rules about celebration because of the U.
You can make an argument.
That, makes this particularly impressive is in 1969, they literally sold tickets to the U games with Burger King burgers.
Yeah.
They couldn't give them away.
The U was literally nothing before. It was nothing. It was Miami University. No, it was the University of Miami, because Miami University is in Ohio. But
they didn't have this. They didn't have the same emblem. The emblem came along after that. I think the emblem came along with Schnellenberger. And Schnellenberger really was the catalyst, and then Jimmy Johnson did some. I can only think if Jimmy Johnson would have stayed there. Can you imagine? They probably would have been relevant through the 2000s.
Yeah. I mean, Dennis Erickson did he did the job. He won 2 national championships. Jimmy Johnson only won 1. Granted, Jimmy Johnson left the NFL. Who knows how many he would have won if he kept going. I think they were fine. And then, like we talked about already with 2 other teams that kind of ruled the 90s, I think it's cyclical. Like, they weren't ever going to just be dominant for it's not like it is now. It's not like it is now where like we talked about earlier, Ohio State's been dominant for 20 years, essentially. Alabama's been dominant for 12, 15 years now. Like, it wasn't really like that at that time. They had shorter runs of Dynasty, and I mean, this has got to be one of the longer ones. I mean, 10 years of it. So, that's all right. Let's move on to the number 1 team on this list. You might have guessed it already. It is Alabama of the present day, 2009 to present, to be exact. I think you could even go like 2008. I think he started in 2007 and kind of had a shit year, or like a 7-6 year or something like that. And then the next year he went like 10 or 10-2 or 10-3, something like that. And then it started with the 2009 championship. But I mean, where do I start here? this is the obvious answer for number one, and I don't really think there's a close argument. 6 national championships with 8 appearances in the title game over the last 12 years, 163-17 with 10 12-plus win seasons and 2 undefeated seasons. 13-5 in bowl games. That 13 is inflated because they had the benefit of playing an extra bowl game essentially the last 6 years, or 5 out of the last 6 years of the playoff. But still 13 bowl game wins. They've been ranked. Here's a fun stat. It says there at the bottom, so you probably already read it. I wish I hadn't put it on there so I could just drop this on you. They were ranked at number 1 in the poll at one point in every single season. I thought that was kind of crazy.
I actually knew that.
That just blows my mind that at least at one point, probably if you look back for the majority of most of those seasons, they were probably number 1.
And I don't think they've really been out of the top 5 since 2009.
There's been like 2, I think there's been 2 breaks where they're not in the top 5. And it was two years ago. And then there was another one like 5 or 6 years ago. I don't remember exactly, but
I love every single time the media's like, oh, is Bama, or is Nick Saban losing his touch? And then he just comes back and drills you. Yeah.
I think my favorite part of this is he's kind of like reinvented himself. It's a lot like Belichick with the Patriots. Like, I know they're synonymous. It's Belichick and it's Saban. Belichick's the best NFL head coach ever. Saban's the best college football coach ever. He reinvents himself on the fly. I mean, you think about those early teams in the early part of the dynasty. It was all offense. You didn't need to. Their defense was just unfair. And then you had running backs like Mark Ingram, who won the Heisman, and Derrick Henry, who won the Heisman, that were just unfair. But then, like, over these last 3 or 4 years, it's just like he's got 4 NFL wide receivers every single year. He's got an NFL offensive line every single year. And now they just have the best offense in the country every single year because that's the way the sport has gone. Whereas a team like Georgia has kind of been left in the dust, where Georgia's still trying to do it the old-fashioned way. We're going to play defense, and we're going to have this pro-style offense, and we're going to run the ball, and it's just obviously not working.
And it's boring.
But yes, and it's very boring. I hate watching Georgia play. A couple more stats. They have 7 SEC championships over that time. They're 7-1 in the SEC championship game. So if they get to the SEC championship game, they're probably going to win it. Here's a number. If I had to ask you how many consensus All-Americans have they had since 2009, what would your guess be?
30 plus.
41 All-Americans.
Jeez.
That is a ridiculous number of All-Americans. 3 Heisman winners. I already mentioned Ingram and Henry, and then, of course, Devontae Smith last year.
Surprising it's not more Heisman winners, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't make if you go back and look at everyone, I don't think there's much of an argument. Maybe here or there's an argument, but I feel like if we look, we could probably do that too sometime. Go back and look at all the Heisman winners. Was it the right pick? I think 3 out of 12 years, that's more than I think any other school has.
Yeah. No, I'm not saying like there needed to be more. I'm just like saying this year there were 3 people on the team that could have been Heisman winners.
Yeah, 100%.
So, I mean, it's this team is just – I used to hate Alabama. I used to hate on them. I used to root against them in every game. But it's gotten to the point now that it's so amazing to watch Nick Saban do this over and over. It's one of those things that I'm just in awe at it. I'm watching history happen, and it's so cool to watch history happen. Yeah. I don't know in my lifetime if we will ever – I hope we don't see another coach that is this good. Like, me being selfish, I want more parity in college football. I want it to be a nationalized game, and in order for it to be a nationalized game, you need to have more winners. And so, I mean, there's only been 42 winners in the last 80 years of the national championship. That's a whole different conversation, but Nick Saban is just, it's amazing. And I'm going to continue until he retires. I'm going to continue watching him. There'll be some games that I don't root for him, but other games I'm going to be pulling for him. This year I was pulling for him in the national championship.
That's just because Ohio State was the other team.
I probably would have rooted for him if it would have been Clemson or Notre Dame too.
That's fair. I probably would have agreed with you on all three of those.
I probably would have rooted for Texas A&M if they would have made it, but
nope. I can't root for Jimbo. I don't know why. I just can't root for Jimbo Fisher.
That's fair. I like Texas A&M. Well, yeah. I mean, shoot. I don't really have anyone to add to this conversation. You've covered pretty much every team that I would have wanted to say. So
I have a couple honorable mentions that we can add on to the end if you'd like.
All right. Well, let's hear
them. Just three. Like I said, Ohio State from 2012 to present. I think I mentioned it when we brought up Ohio State at number 9. It's an easy argument where you could flip those or just put it all together and make one giant dynasty. Oklahoma in the early 2000s. They won the national championship in 2000, had a Heisman winner in 2003 with Jason White, Adrian Peterson, Bob Stoops, obviously. They could have very easily made this list. Not as exciting, I guess, not as sexy, I don't think, as a lot of other teams on this list. And finally, it would have been Penn State of the early to mid-'80s, roughly like 1980 to 86. They won 2 championships during that time. They could have very easily made this list as well, but not today. I said no.
All right. Well, I want to thank you all for listening and watching today. If you like our content, please make sure to subscribe on any of the platforms that you listen to us and like our videos. And if you feel really strongly about it, we'd really appreciate it if you share or comment. It really helps us out.